Good morning, everyone. My name is Mohamed Elmi. I'm the Executive Director of the Diversity Institute, and I'm here and I'm honored to be speaking during Black History Month and the International Decade for the People of African Descent. For the next, I wrote down 50 minutes, but I'll try to cut it down significantly. So for the next short little while, I will be joined by my colleagues, by my colleague Nancy Mitchell, the Interim Director of Research Special Projects at the Diversity Institute, and the ever-brilliant Nadine Spencer, CEO, BrandEQ, and former CEO of the Black Business and Professional Association. The title of our presentation is Where Are We Now? An update on the economic challenges and progress in Canada in education, employment, entrepreneurship, and leadership. So I will lead off the presentation by presenting the research to set our ground of where we are in terms of education and employment. I will be followed by Nadine, who will talk about Black entrepreneurship, and finally Nancy, who will contextualize Black leadership in Canada. We understand the importance of issues such as rights, justice, and health, but in this particular discussion, we'll be focusing more on the economic issues. I'm sure many of you know that the Diversity Institute is the research lead for the Future Skills Center and our partner for this event today. But we're also home to the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub and an ecosystem partner for the 50-30 Challenge, a national program that was developed by the federal government to help improve equity, diversity, and inclusion across sectors that goes beyond employment equity categories that were developed in the 1980s. Having said that, I'm glad I get to follow independent expert member who provided the context of the work that they're doing. And in this final year of the first decade, we want to reflect, take stock of what has been done, what the context is in Canada, and look at the more than 200 million people who identify as being part of the African descent that live in the Americas, but also worldwide, and particularly the presentation that we're focusing on here in Canada. Now, this is where I get to be the bore and give you the data, but data is so crucial to understand the demographic makeup of the country, the barriers faced by people who identify as Black, those of African descent as well. And one of the things we often lacked for the longest time in this country, particularly compared to the US, was data that identified Black individuals or people of African descent. We were grouped into that ginormous, if ginormous is still a word, category of visible minority. And so you could not really dig deeper than that. We understand that there, according to the 2021 census, that there are about 1.5 million people in Canada who are reported being Black, about 4.3% of the population, and about 16% of that big visible minority category that Statistics Canada uses, or racialized people as well. So when we're looking at the population, we understand that it is younger than the general Canadian population at about 29.6 years versus 40.7 years of the Canadian population. When we're digging deeper into looking at the population trends over the last 2 decades plus, we know that the Black population has increased from about 2.2% to now more than 4.3% of the population. And more importantly, the source of the Black population in the country is increasing. It's highly diverse. I mean, look at the room we're in. People who have always been here. And I always like to, I attended a Black Canadian Studies Association discussion in Halifax in 2015. And I learned at that conference that one of the first Black individuals to come to Canada came on the original boats with the colonizers of what is now Canada. Imagine that. I would never have known that in the school system. Because I myself, an immigrant, I came here when I was 12 years old. I settled in New Brunswick, for anybody on the East Coast here, from the East Coast. And so I did not know that. I just assumed many came more recently or came as slaves after, but not literally on one of the original boats that came to the continent. And interestingly, he was a translator, so something to think about. And we know more recently the Black population in the 60s came mainly from the Caribbean, but has increasingly come from Africa. And about 60% or 65% now come from Africa rather than the Caribbean. Now, when we're looking at barriers that are still faced by Canadians, Black Canadians specifically, even though 32.4% of the Black population aged 25 to 64 has a bachelor's degree or higher, that's a higher proportion than the overall population at about 32.9%. But Black Canadians earn about 75.6% compared to non-racialized workers. Another sad statistic is about 16% of Black workers with a bachelor's degree or higher from a Canadian institution, that is, a Canadian institution, worked in occupations that only require a high school diploma or less. This is the highest rate of overqualification for any Canadian educated racialized group. Black individuals are underrepresented in technology. Now, I happen to be extremely lucky in that I ran into an individual who became my doctoral supervisor, and he was one of the only individuals in the US in the 1980s to get an information systems degree. He said he was one of 4 in all of the US, in the United States. And so I ended up in a tech sector, but we are woefully underrepresented in that sector. Now, when we're looking at education, whether in high school, those without high school diploma or have a post-secondary degree or certificate, it's interesting when we look, there has been some improvement there and a decrease for those who, since 2016 census, the trend seems to be getting more education. When we're looking at students in high school, there's been an increase in Black students obtaining an undergraduate degree and a decrease in Black students obtaining a certificate or a diploma. I mentioned high school, I meant undergraduate degree. When we looked at the perceptions of racism and stereotypes, as a divide between generations, we noticed that students, about half, 51%, cited racism as the biggest challenge for the Black community. And we can make some assumptions and draw some conclusions from that. Maybe that they're younger and see injustices a little bit more, and for those of us in middle age might have started to accept those injustices as norm. And so we can make some assumptions there. There are still barriers for those within the education system for Black Canadians. A majority of the white teachers and those who are in the education system still use a very Eurocentric and do not offer a decolonized curriculum for even Indigenous individuals in Canada. Black faculty members are underrepresented across Canadian universities, and so this is a pathway that many do not see. In Toronto, which has the largest Canadian Black population, and the Toronto District School Board, which is the largest school board in the country, about 11% of students identified as Black. But when we start looking at differences in things like academic programs, suspensions and expulsions, we noticed that Black students were disproportionately represented compared to non-racialized students. We also noticed that there's still streaming, even though promises have been made, and I hope Trevor Massey is here. I did not get a chance to see him, but through programs like the Lifelong Leadership Institute, to expose students to science, technology, engineering, and math options for them at an early age. As I mentioned, I have an information systems degree, but when I was in high school in New Brunswick, I think I was in grade 10 or 11, I forget the year. I was called into a parent-teacher meeting with my mom, and the teacher told my mom, Mohamed is really struggling with his math. You should put him in level 3 math, which would not have counted towards credit towards getting into university in New Brunswick. I was in level 1 math. So my mom said, that's not gonna happen. He's gonna go to university. So how about we compromise and we put him in level 2 math and see how he does. When I realized that my university options were narrowing if I did not at least pass level 2 math, I buckled down and ended up graduating with honors. And it was just because I had an advocate who realized that you would be closing off that option for university completely if you go down to level 3 math. And I'm sure my life would have been easier and I had less homework, and I might not be standing here today had my mom said, no, that's not happening, you know? So this is where I speed through my presentation because I've already taken up time. And just let you know that data is really important as we dig through this process. We need the data, and I'm so glad to know that, for example, the Canadian government recently amended the employment equity legislation to include a Black category. They promised. They promised. I have faith they will carry it through, but they have promised to include the Black category. And as you'll see later through the presentation on leadership, how it was crucial to show the underrepresentation of Black people in leadership positions. Yes, in the corporate sector is woeful, but right across all of the other various sectors as well. And so I know Wendy has stepped out for a call, but Wendy is part of the lawsuit as an expert witness on equity, diversity, and inclusion that was filed by former federal public servants who are suing the federal government. And that is another way we were able to get data that was not public about the severe underrepresentation of Black individuals in key decisions across our institutions that did not reflect the population, the Canadian population at large. And so it's still not certified, but that is progressing as we speak. And so with that, I'd like to turn it over to Nadine. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Mohamed. Good morning, everyone. How are we? We're still feeling great? Fantastic. It is truly, truly great to be here, and I thank the Diversity Institute. You know, we all talked about and acknowledged Wendy, but in the work that we do, it's not enough. We need allies, and maybe the allies don't look like us, but we need allies that will open doors, be brave enough to have the conversations like this, and convene and bring people together. So for that, I am always, always full of gratitude and thanks. So I'm going to talk a little bit about data when it comes to Black entrepreneurs. So they say there's 3 things in life that does not lie: the mirror, children, and I know this because my little granddaughter, when she looks at me, she says, "Nana, the pants is tight." She's telling the truth. And data. The data doesn't lie, and this is why we need data, because without data, how are we going to know where the gaps are? They say if it's not measured, it's not managed. And especially in our community, if we don't have the numbers, how are we going to know what needs to be done? So this is why the dialogue on data is so very important. We're convening at a pivotal moment where the International Decade for People of African Descent intersects with Canada's ongoing pursuit of social and economic inclusion, presenting a shared value for a more equitable and prosperous future. But what does it really mean? What does it mean for people of color, for people of African descent? So I remembered 4 years ago, no, it was 7 years ago, when I was in Ottawa and we launched the decade. I was very hopeful. There was a room of people that was very hopeful as to what we imagined the tangible outcomes were going to be. But here we are, many years later, and how do we know? Who knows what changes has happened since the declaration? We really can't point to many things, right? And so I'm glad that we're going into the second decade. And data is going to be critical as we look at the second decade. So when we look at Black entrepreneurs, I've been an entrepreneur since the age of 12. I believe in entrepreneurship as a viable opportunity. Actually, I believe in entrepreneurship as the only opportunity for Black people to make profound difference and change and to have what we all talk about as generational wealth. I was the former CEO of the Black Business and Professional Association, where we worked with entrepreneurs across the country to provide opportunities and really look at systemic challenges that we face because of our skin color. So what we recognize is this: Black individuals are less likely to be self-employed compared to non-racialized individuals, 9.1% versus 13.6%. Black entrepreneurs face challenges accessing funding, financing, gaining credibility for their services, finding clients. In a survey of 342 Black business owners, we found this out. 82% reported that financing their businesses through personal savings or credit cards. When I talk to Black women entrepreneurs, they talk about financing their businesses through their credit cards and paying high interest because they cannot We cannot get access to funding. I was just speaking to an entrepreneur here today, Tanya, who has an HR business, and may have challenges because of lack of funding. Why is it that we see that amongst each other? And I talk to my colleagues who are, what I say mainstream, and they don't seem to have those same challenges as we do. There was a study of over 700 Black women entrepreneurs, and it revealed that, we tend to operate in major cities, we have fewer employees, we have newer businesses, and we still earn less than $100,000 a year. Yet, we're still starting businesses at huge speeds. And you know why? Because we opt out of, what systemic challenges in corporate Canada, because we have to start businesses. We have to start businesses to enable a future for ourselves and our children. And so when we look at Black-owned businesses, Stephanie mentioned, she talked about the move, the economic opportunities of the move. And what we realize is that, immigrants are starting businesses at a fast rate. And why is that? Because we come into the country looking for new opportunities like my mother did, and then because of systemic challenges, we have to start our own businesses. And then we start our own businesses, and then we still have those challenges. But there's a higher percentage of non-immigrants and non-Black-owned businesses, yet there's still growth for immigrants looking for business opportunities. When COVID started, one of the things we did at the BBPA, one of the first things we did, I got an email one day at my desk, and there was a study by the Canadian Federation of Independent Businesses, and it looked at the disparity for those well-capped mainstream businesses. So what we did, we then compared that to our members' businesses. And one of the things we found is that the businesses in mainstream, they had 6 months minimum cash reserves in their companies. But when we spoke to the Black entrepreneurs, most of them, almost 90% of them, had no cash reserves. And why is that? We know the answer. Lack of access, lack of mentorship, someone to say, this is how your business should be capitalized, and this is the resources you need should there be an emergency. And when COVID happened, that was a big emergency. So it was a huge disparity that we found. Many of those businesses were concerned that they were going to permanently close. 85% of the Black-owned businesses that we surveyed were in fear that they were going to close, versus 39% from the mainstream businesses. And then guess what? We found out in Little Jamaica when we started, we had about 145 businesses, and then it got down to 60 businesses. But because of the work that we did at the BBPA, they were able to grow those numbers back up to about 95. So you see what happens when we support Black-owned businesses. But it was a glaring difference that we saw with the comparison as to what the challenges were for Black-owned businesses versus non-Black-owned businesses. So when we look at barriers and resilience of Black entrepreneurs, a 2021 survey showed that 76% of Black entrepreneurs found that race makes it harder to succeed. In 2023, Black business owners, 22% were most likely to report very optimistic future outlook over the next 12 months in comparison to all business owners, 18.9% operating in the private sector. One of the things that we see in this chart here, we look at Black women and men in entrepreneurship. It's encouraging because it's showing that it's still growing, that Black individuals are still looking to entrepreneurship as an option to build sustainable wealth, generational wealth for themselves and their families. So when we think of an entrepreneur, if you Google it, you'll see. Google entrepreneurs. You're very rarely going to see people of color. You're not going to see Black people. And if you look at this, not many women, a few. So imagine, this is a narrative of what we think about when we think about entrepreneurship and people in leadership. When you Google and you do that search, you're not going to find us represented. The speakers today, we talked about representation and representation mattering. So if our children and our young professionals are looking at, when you think of entrepreneurship and you're seeing white male, what do we think is possible for us? What do we imagine? And then I want to talk a little bit about Black women entrepreneurs. So most of you know my story. I've been a boss woman since the age of 12. I found a future for myself through entrepreneurship, and I work with women across the country to find opportunities for themselves through entrepreneurship. And this is why it's so important that we disaggregate the data and we really look at what it is to enable supports for Black women entrepreneurs, because we are the matriarchs. You know, I love, Mohamed, that you shared that your mother made you do the math, right? This is why we need to strengthen Black women, because we're going to push for our children to excel and to succeed and to do the hard work now so we don't have to worry about it later. So many Black women are motivated to get into entrepreneurship. We have sad experiences in corporate Canada and other places, including anti-Black racism within the mainstream labor market. And we have a desire to celebrate Black culture and to, find products that addresses our unmet market needs. Not many people are making hair care products for Black individuals. So we have to be those entrepreneurs in the marketplace that's going to make the products that we need. Black women often lead young businesses. They say 68% that are smaller are in low growth sectors, so service industry, beauty industry, and the food industry, and so forth. So when we look at the demographics of one of the programs that we've done, the Rise Up Pitch competition, and Stephanie was here, Stephanie Day, and she was one of the individuals with Nancy, we're the three amigos with Wendy, that started the Rise Up Pitch competition, which is now a legacy with the BBPA and the Diversity Institute. But what we recognize is that 45% of those women identified as African, 44% identified as Afro-Caribbean, 37% had bachelor's degrees, and 23% had master's degrees. 40% of the applicants were between the ages of 25 to 34. What we see is that Black women were starting businesses at a very fast rate. And we had, in the last Rise Up Pitch competition, there were 1,700 women that applied. Guess for how much? $10,000. So we had 1,700 women that applied for $10,000 of prize money. It goes to show how many people are pushing and coming to the table for such a small amount. And we're grateful, because one of the women that called me, she said, Nadine, I didn't get the money, but j'ai gagné. That means I won because I was able to receive financial literacy, business plans, and for the first time, she says, I'm trying to say it en français. She says, pour les premiers temps, je comprends quoi les affaires. I understood about business and financial literacy. I truly understand business literacy. And now I can take it to the bank. I can literally take it to the bank in terms of the acumen that I use when I go into the bank, that they see me, because a lot of the times they don't see us. So I understand the vernacular, and I may not have gotten the $10,000, but I got the value. And this is why we need to support programs for Black women entrepreneurs. And then we saw that 65% of applicants said that cost of borrowing was a barrier. I'm a co-founder of FACE, the Federation of African Canadian Economics, and we see that the cost of borrowing for entrepreneurs is a barrier. One of the things we do when we do the business plans, we have to put in the loan payments as part of the financial piece and the interest, and then sometimes we realize, oh my goodness, we really can't afford this. So there's a lot of learnings that has to happen. And so now I want to focus on when you see it, what you can be. I truly believe that when you see it, you can be it. And we need to have more and more Black women in leadership, in entrepreneurship that have had success, be very visible, because we cannot see what we cannot be. And as Ms. Curry says, strong Black leadership is in us. It is in us. And the only way, yes, that we're going to mentor and sponsor and bring each other up is to see. So, I'm really very pleased to have a few leaders in this room. So we have Cheryl Kerr, the CEO of MedX, who is a dynamic, successful Black woman entrepreneur. We have Pauline Christian, the former, I stand on her shoulders, the former president of the Black Business and Professional Association. And we also have our vice president, she was on the next panel, Frances Del Sol at the Black Business and Professional Association. It is so important that we give voice. You know, one of the things that I love about the Black Anthem, it says, you know, lift every voice. We have to give voice to our people. We have to give visibility to our people, because this is how we then can know the path. You know, we have money and we have power, as Stephanie says, that we have money and we have power. We can have money and we can have power, because, you know, she talked about the billions of dollars in remittance, right? If you read the narrative, so I'm in the marketing world, and I believe that, you know, if we don't tell our stories, no one will tell it the way in which we need it, right? But, you know, when we talk about the Black community, we're not talking about the billions of dollars we have and the power that we have. We need to tell these stories. We need to look at the data, tell these stories, so we can lead a path, a better path for the future. One of the things that I recognize in this work, the biggest challenge that Black businesses face, you know what that is? It's that the owners are Black. Think about that, right? The biggest challenges that Black businesses face is that the owners are Black. Because with that, we have the systemic challenges. We have lack of access in all areas. So we really have to traject to a narrative that is going to change that. And with the data, that is how we're going to make the change. So, data highlights disparities faced by Black entrepreneurs, which is funding, building credibility, and disparities in income and business operations, particularly amongst women, Black women. And, you know, as Maya Angelou says, and still I rise, and still we rise. It is Black History Month. We are on the cusp of International Women's Month. We need to look at the data and also the awareness, because, you know, they say if a tree falls in the forest and no one is there to hear it, does it make a sound? No, absolutely not. So we need to build awareness around the decade. It is very critical. I was talking to Ms. Curry and I said, you know, a lot of people still do not know that you talk about the second decade, a lot of people, they don't even know that we had a first decade, right? And so this is why we need the awareness. And it's important that, you know, we build one another up to tell our stories. But I do believe that c'est possible pour tout, for all of us. Thank you.
Okay, great. So I am your last data person. For the rest of the presentation, we'll be focusing on Black individuals in leadership roles, and really thinking about who shapes the narrative, who makes the policies that our communities abide by, who develops the programs, who disperses the funding. Then we'll follow up with some tangible strategies for change, and then we'll pivot to a panel where I'm hoping we can focus on hope and optimism and what we're looking forward to in the future. So this is our Diversity Leads data. It looks at the representation of women, racialized individuals, and Black individuals at the board level across major cities in Canada. This is new data. Some of you may have seen our 2020 data, and if you saw that, you would have seen that there are extreme disparities that exist in Toronto in particular between the total Black population and between the number or the representation of Black individuals on boards. This data has been updated, and we do see that there are shifts in the gaps. So the gaps at the Toronto level has changed, which is optimistic, and I'm pleased to see that change. On the other hand, we see that gaps have widened in Montreal and in Ottawa, and I'll just take Montreal for an example. You see that the Black population is 7.9% of the population, but we only hold 4.5% of board roles. And I think this is a theme that you'll see throughout the data that's presented in leadership, is that we've made progress in some areas, but ultimately no progress in others. So a step forward, but a step back too. Disparities also exist at the executive leadership level. And I'll point you to the data, the bars that exist on the far left. So this is the percentage of Black leaders on boards and in executive teams on S&P and TSX companies. 81.3% of boards have 0 Black people. 85.1% have 0 Black people on their executive teams. More than 50%, more than 60%, more than 70%, 0 representation. So we've looked at boards and we've looked at executive leadership teams, and this goes back to my point earlier of who's actually developing policies, who's actually developing programs, who's shaping our narrative. It's not us in many cases. So why do these barriers exist? A lot of times I hear, there just aren't Black people in leadership. That's not the case. Well, I guess it is the case, but I think you have to look at the leaky pipeline. So the leaky pipeline is ultimately understanding where the barrier exists in the milestones that people achieve in their career. So you see that here, it's not that Black people aren't participating in the workforce. It's not that we have a low employment rate. But when you go all the way up to the management level, which is really a pathway to executive leadership, we drop significantly, 5.3%. Like I said, that's the pathway to get into these executive roles in many cases. So if you're trying to understand where the barriers exist, you have to look down in the pipeline. You have to get into interventions that are limiting Black people from getting into management roles. Something that's not on the screen, but I think is really important for Black women in particular, is the glass cliff. And we don't talk about this a lot because it's uncomfortable to talk about. But it's the scenario where we put Black women in positions of leadership during times of crises, or we put them in positions that are underfunded and undersupported, whether that's financially or personnel-wise. And then we wonder why they didn't succeed, or why they left. We never investigate why someone didn't stay at an organization. That's an intervention as well. So here I want to highlight the leaky pipeline, but I also want to highlight the glass cliff. That's something that we don't talk about, that impacts Black women at a disproportionate rate. I am optimistic. We do see some changes, particularly when interventions and programs are put in place. So this is the Black North Initiative, and we do have colleagues on the panel that are going to speak to this more in depth. But you'll see that among those companies that have pledged towards the Black North Initiative, they do have higher rates of Black individuals on their boards and on their executive teams. So this is among S&P and TSX companies. So I'll just run through it quickly. 3.1% on boards for Black North, 1.9 for non-members. 1.5, so similar, sorry. But then among Black North individuals, percent of companies with no Black leaders, this is less for Black North companies compared to non-members. So what I do want to highlight here is that among those that are participating in these kind of programs that are driving change, you do see that change does exist. Okay, and this is a similar slide. It's just among the TSX companies, and it tells a similar story, so I won't walk through it. But the overall point is that those that are participating in these programs are seeing progress. I don't only want to focus on the private sector. I want to talk about our governments because, like I said, who is shaping the policy? Who is dispersing the funding? Who is developing the programs? So we see that across Canada, Black individuals are underrepresented in cabinet and across all the different political parties. And this is really an area for change. We need to understand what the gaps are in terms of political power, political advancement, so that we can make interventions so that people have opportunities for leadership roles in the political space. So there are levers for change. I think that barriers exist at the societal, the organizational, and the individual level, but with barriers come opportunities for progress. So at the societal level, this is where we're speaking about, again, policies, programs, infrastructure. We're talking about societal barriers, and we're talking about narratives at the media. At the organizational level, we're talking about organizational processes, and this goes back to the leaky pipeline and also the glass cliff that I mentioned. And then we're talking about the individual level, interpersonal racism, how we treat people on the day-to-day. And I know that that seems a little bit fluffy and sometimes it gets lost, but actually that's a big reason why people leave the workplace, the relationships we have with our colleagues, the relationships we have with our managers, allyship, who's rooting for us to fail. So ultimately for the next section, we'll talk about the barriers that exist, but ultimately the opportunities, and then we'll pivot into the panel. So one of the levers for change that exists at the societal level, is legislation and codes. And as Gaynell mentioned, sometimes you need people to be required to move the needle. Sometimes voluntary action works, and I will show you a couple of frameworks where that has moved the needle, but ultimately organizations need to be required to support Black individuals. And there are a number of legislations that exist across Canada. We're talking about employment equity, we're talking about the Accessible Canada Act, we're talking about Bill C-25, pay equity, et cetera. Ultimately, legislation that is requiring organizations to investigate internally, understand barriers, and support Black individuals. There are also voluntary codes that I'll talk about, the 50-30 Challenge, 30% Club, and the Black North Initiative. So I won't go too much in depth because, like I said, we will have a colleague on the panel that will speak about this, but you did see the data earlier. This is really an organization that is encouraging organizations across Canada to make change and support the Black community, particularly in leadership roles. You'll see that they've made great progress. The Black North Initiative has helped raise $10 million to fund Black businesses and a Black business development hub. So this is a network across Canada where organizations are pledging to support diverse Black communities. We can talk about the 50-30 Challenge, and this is a voluntary code that is really aiming to encourage organizations to strive for gender parity, but also the increased representation of Black individuals on boards and at the senior leadership level. And I would say that it has reach and it has impact. I particularly work on the portfolio, and we have over 2,000 organizations across Canada that have signed up. There's definitely more to go, for sure, but I do think that that demonstrates a real need and real progress. And we do see that these organizations are then coming back to me and saying, okay, Nancy, I've signed up. Where can I go from here? What change can I actually make? How can I better my policies? What can I do with my HR processes? What can I do to tackle bias and microaggressions among the people that actually work for my organization? And that's why I want to highlight that we do have reach, but we have organizations that want to make a real change. And so I am optimistic about these kinds of voluntary codes and driving change forward. We need to shift the narrative, and I think this is something that exists at the societal, the organizational, and the individual level. Yes, barriers exist, and discrimination and racism is real. But are we always painting the Black community in a deficit? Are we focusing on Black empowerment? Are we focusing on Black joy? I feel like in the media, we never just see Black people existing. We have to see 12 Years a Slave, or we have to see, a story of extreme success. We never just see Black people having the day-to-day experiences of joy, triumph, sadness, etc. So what kind of narratives are we painting? Shifting the framework or the narrative so that we show people in moments of empowerment, moments of regular life, moments of joy. At the organizational level, I won't go into this in depth too much because I know we want to get to the panel, but ultimately there are levers for change that exist across all organizational processes. At the leadership or governance level, what kind of strategies do you have? Are you baking efforts to address anti-Black racism into your policies, your programs, your strategies? At the human resource level, are you addressing the glass cliff that I mentioned, the leaky pipeline that I mentioned? Are you intentional with outreaching to and recruiting Black individuals? What kind of talent pools are you sourcing from? The values and culture, this is the interpersonal. Do you have policies against anti-Black racism? Do you educate people on microaggressions? Do you ensure that the workplace feels inclusive for all those individuals that are in it? Are you tracking the work that you're doing? Are you understanding the successes that are coming from your efforts and the gaps that remain? Are you addressing diversity across the value chain, really understanding how you're baking efforts to address anti-Black racism in service delivery? Do your services actually reach the Black community? Do your programs reach the Black community? Are you supporting Black entrepreneurs, and particularly Black women entrepreneurs? And then are you giving back? What kind of partnerships do you have with Black-led organizations? What about schools? How are you reaching Black youth and the next generation of leaders? And I'll just go through 2 slides quickly, and then I'll wrap up and we'll get to the panel. So ultimately, a real lever for change, and this connects to Nadine's talk, is supporting Black entrepreneurs. If you're an organization that has an opportunity for procurement, why not engage in spending practices that support Black communities, lifts them up, allows them to thrive? Ensuring that your programs, your services, et cetera, take a lens that support the Black community, ensuring that you understand who's actually accessing your services and your programs. So ultimately, across the value chain, you're really thinking of procurement, but you're thinking of service delivery, program development, program delivery, how you actually support the external community. And then the last is measurement. And like I said, and I mean, you know, because we're data people, the data is so important. If you have an organization, you need to understand how many Black people or what is the representation of Black people at the entry level, management level, executive level. But I will say that while we mostly presented quantitative data, the qualitative data is equally important, and actually, in my opinion, is more important, because a lot of the nuances exist in the stories that individual Black people will tell you, and that gets lost. Oh, thanks. Yeah, let's give it up for that. It's not enough to just say, oh, there's 5% of Black people in executive leadership roles. Why? What are the barriers? What are people's experiences? Why are they leaving? What exists in the stories that you're not gaining because you're only focusing on quantitative data? And so if you're collecting data in your organization, understand too what people's experiences are. And there's a number of ways to do that. I'm happy to connect with you. Exit interviews, surveys, one-on-ones with managers, et cetera. Okay, so this is our pivot slide. There are a number of resources, capacity building opportunities, programs that exist at the BBPA, Basel, ADAPT, et cetera, the Boss Women's program that the BBPA puts on. So I'll leave this and you can have a look, and then I do want to introduce our panel. So that's it on the data, thanks.